Welcome to another webinar in the Axim Global webinar series. My name is Andrew Rufner and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webinar is on the secret life of DNS, but before we get into the actual meat of the presentation, a couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, as you probably noticed, throughout the call, you'll be muted. But in your webinar client, you have a question section. So if throughout the webinar, if you've got any questions that you would like to ask John, the presenter, then please put them into the question section. We will collect them, and then at the end of the webinar, we've got a Q&A session, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. In addition, we're currently recording this webinar. The recording of the webinar will be made available through the Axim Global website as well as our YouTube channel. So if after the webinar you think you've missed things or you'd like to pass that on to somebody else, you've got the ability to do so. And then ultimately, obviously, I'd like to invite you all to follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter, where we will publish news and announce upcoming webinar announcements. Okay, with the housekeeping done, John, I'd love to pass over to you for the introduction and the webinar that we're all looking forward to very much.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all tuning in. My name is John Bambenek. I am Vice President of Security and Research and Intelligence at Threatstop. I also teach at the Department of Computer Science and Information Science at the University of Illinois, and have a long period of history in cybersecurity generally, tracking down criminal threats. In fact, this morning, not one I was working on, but a criminal group that behind the Gosnam malware was arrested. So that's good news. So I like participating in those options or operations when I can. But we'll kind of jump right into it. Despite the good news today that we got people arrested for cybercrime, there are more criminals than there are law enforcement. International law enforcement is very hard. It requires countries to cooperate, and many countries don't want to cooperate with the United States and vice versa. We operate openly. They know what we do. They know how we protect networks, but we have to figure out what they're doing. And we don't really have enough people to do it. If you imagine all the malware in the world, there's not enough reverse engineers out there to take a look at it. And many of you listening to this may be working at small to medium-sized businesses where you may have a person responsible for security, and that person may have IT responsibilities also. We have tons of businesses that just can't afford a lot of security. So I like saying we're on the losing ends of an arms race. This graph specifically here is on malware. The orange line is new malware, unique new malware seen per day. And on, the last time I generated this graph in March is about 400,000 samples. What's scary is what's between the orange and the green line. And that is the number of samples not detected by anything but are still malicious. But even at that scale, there's too much going on, then we can, manually just ad hoc and grind, especially if that's true for small to medium business. But this presentation, we're going to focus specifically on DNS and a little primer about how DNS works. DNS was written in 1980. It's almost a 40-year-old protocol. Before there was e-commerce, before there was Facebook and Google, before even AOL was sending you CDs for 500 hours of free internet, DNS was a system to allow for global addressing of machines. It's very decentralized, and it still works today substantially in the way it was written in 1980. It's the underpinning of how the internet works. It's when you go to www.google.com, it turns that into a machine addressable and reachable address, because computers only understand ones and zeros, but human beings are not good with that, right? We just want to go to google.com. We don't want to memorize IP addresses. So how this works, right? Step one is I want to go to some webserver.com. You go to your DNS recursive server that says, hey, what's the address of google.com? Then it goes to the root servers. Okay, where is .com? Because it is a decentralized hierarchical system. If that entry is not cached, okay, where is .com? Then it goes to number 4 if it doesn't know, right? Where's the .com namespace? Then it goes to the authoritative DNS servers for google.com to get an actual IP address. So it's a multi-step process. There's caching, so there's storage of some of these things, so you don't have to always looking up where .com is. But this is the underpinning of how all of everything that happens on the internet basically works, with some very rare exceptions. Right? This is how we use it right here as a step process of when you type something in the web browser or send an email or look at Netflix or whatever you happen to do on the internet. It goes to these steps to figure out how to go from that PC, your laptop or mobile device, to whatever remote service you're trying to access. The security benefit of this, because everything on the internet starts with DNS, well, almost all malicious activity also starts with DNS. So you have the ability, if you control DNS recursive server, and almost every organization does, whether it's Active Directory or something in their router, you can populate those with lists of bad IPs and bad host names. So instead of when you type in www.badsite.com, you get something else depending on what you define, right? Because everything on the internet starts with a DNS query. Almost everything on the internet that's malicious also starts with a DNS query. And you can use literally a 1980s era protocol to help protect the network, and it's something you already have. One use case I have 6 kids. Some of them are quite young. They like going on YouTube and watching videos. I'm sure many of you have been on YouTube, and you have the wide variety of things that may be inappropriate. I use response policy zones so that when they go to YouTube, they're redirected to the parental control version, and they simply just don't see the inappropriate videos. And interestingly enough, it actually blocks YouTube comments, so they don't even see any of the comments on these videos either. But I do that all at the DNS level to protect my kids, powered off a Raspberry Pi, a $50 device with some settings on there in RPZ. So we'll talk a little bit about response policy zones and the things you can detect on, right? You can look at host names or domains if you think www.google.com is bad, or, malware.badsite.com, whatever host name or domain you can think of, including the ability to wildcard. So everything under google.com you could block if you want. The resolved IP address. We have large lists of malicious IP addresses out there. You could say, hey, this is resolving, google.com is resolving to an IP address in Russia. We know that IP address is malicious from open source research or something that you're seeing in your own investigations. You could say, hey, that's resolving to a place I don't like, so I'm going to block it. You can also block on the name server name or IP address also. One of my areas of PhD research is creating authoritative name server reputation, because criminals, like any other technology company, need to have infrastructure. Authoritative name servers are a piece of that, and measuring the relative maliciousness of authoritative name servers to say, hey, you know what, these 10 name servers are purely criminal, you can block that. So you can detect on those 4 things and do something with it, right? So what you can return is an X domain, which is the response when a domain is not found. The actual DNS response code is an X domain. You can log the query, but let it happen. If you're leery about blocking threats right away, or there's some that you might not be as fully confident that should be blocked, you can put those in logs and then review it later and have somebody in your security team take a look. What's most interesting is that you can modify the query to point your consumer or your user to something that we call a walled garden. So you go to www.badsite.com. It says, oh, it's the IP address that Badsite says it is. We're going to ignore that. We're going to point you to another web server or another IP address. And that's very useful for creating security awareness. I'm sure many of you have annual security awareness programs or little things that people fill out, and we all know that users kind of ignore that. But if they click on a phishing link in an email, and immediately it comes up with a web page that says, you just clicked on a phishing link, this is what it pointed to, this is some tips of how not to do that again. You can give some real-time security awareness training to employees, and research shows that's the most effective way to deliver it. There's actually two companies I can think of off the top of my head that have made business models on real-time security awareness training like that. The configuration looks like a normal DNS zone, right? There's serial numbers and time to live and how often it's refreshed. But you see in here 3 domain names that are blocked. or 6 entries in total, 3 domain names that are based on domain generation algorithms that are part of a malware family, and then the wildcard entry star dot. So if you want to block everything under that domain, you can do that. And the CNAME dot means it will return NX domain. So if somebody takes a look at oys.com, because they click on a link in email, there's malicious advertising they see in a web browser. However, they happen to be redirected to that site. It will not work. The query won't work. And if the DNS query doesn't work, the malware or malicious activity doesn't know how to find the criminal for instructions, or find the mining pool for cryptojacking, or find the encryption keys for ransomware, or for phishing websites, to find the phishing website to do credential theft. You can think of every particular genre of malicious activity, and there's DNS involved in the chain, and interdicting it prevents the attack from ever happening in the first place. You can do the same thing for IP addresses. These are 2 net blocks that Spam House has identified as spam networks. You put the IP address in reverse notation, and you can block entire networks. So you see 5.8.37.0 and every address in there. And again, right, this returns NX domain. So entire networks are bulletproof hosting providers that cater to spammers, that cater to scammers, phishing, you name it. Again, they have to have infrastructure to make their attacks work, if you know what that infrastructure is. And there's a great deal of open source intelligence out there. We know a lot about the threats. You can preemptively block that. So if somebody makes a mistake, if malware does get on a machine and it tries to beacon to its command and control server, you can still block it. So those attacks aren't successful. So if somehow ransomware gets on a corporate machine, say, yesterday, right, there's big news of remote desktop vulnerability that allows for remote code execution. If there's a specific family of ransomware they're aware of, right, you know, the ransomware might get on the machine, but it can't reach its command and control server to get its encryption key. Yeah, you've got a malware binary on a machine, but it's not doing anything because it can't start the process of encryption. So there's lots of ability to protect things, even if there are a couple of mistakes made along the way, because DNS is used so often in the chain of operations, in the chain of infection, in malicious activities. You can do the same for name servers. These are 2 good name servers, so I don't recommend you blocking them. One is for my consulting company. If you want to block NS1, BambenekConsulting.com, you can do that. You could block Quad 8, which is obviously Google's DNS server. Those are 2 benign things. You don't want to block them, but it gives you a simple example of how to do that, right? And you see this. It's a text-based configuration file, at least when you do it through bind. You can do it in Active Directory too, where there's a GUI snap-in to put in values that you want to block, but fairly simple and straightforward configuration on how to do that. The problem is getting data, right? Despite its simplicity, right? There's lots of malicious domains out there. You know, I believe I've got 2 million or so that I'm tracking currently out of 340 million. There's lots of IP lists out there because many of the attacks are very loud and noisy. But going back to the RDP vulnerability that was announced yesterday, there are criminals who are scanning the entire internet right now for RDP servers. Well, I could sit there and take a look at my firewall logs. Hey, you're scanning on port 3389. Maybe I put a honeypot out there. I can populate those servers or these lists of IP addresses that are actually attacking and then block them in DNS. You know, but there are lots of lists out there. We know a lot about the threat, right? Going back to the original graph, you know, of all the samples of files submitted to Virus Total, we know about 400,000 already. This is a much smaller number that we don't know about, but we know a lot about the threat. Some of those feeds are documented, some are not. You know, some have, you know, not documented confidence, and confidence in this case is how sure am I that a specific IP address or a specific domain name is actually malicious. Attackers can and do manipulate that data, and I could talk in detail about that, but that could be its own webinar in its own right. But there's lots of ambiguity in here of things you could do. You could take these threat lists and block them immediately. And if you're okay with dealing with false positives, that might be an appropriate point to take. But there's lots of nuance in there. Criminals will compromise websites and then use them to distribute malware. Do you want to block a compromised website? there's shared infrastructure, right? There's malicious domains sitting on GoDaddy IPs or Cloudflare. If you block those, you're blocking millions of sites simultaneously. There needs to be some nuance in whitelisting. But again, a lot of this is straightforward. The whitelisting is very straightforward because, as I said, you can log queries, but let them happen anyway. So if I identify an IP address that's occasionally used in malicious activity, but may correspond to otherwise benevolent activity, I can log that and then have that for analysis at some point later. So as an example of how you can use this, I go to the use case of domain generation algorithms. It was very popular in malware the past few years, where basically hackers create a mathematical program to take some defined inputs to create lists of predictable domains. That input may be date, it may be a numerical seed or string in the malware, whatever it is. They take something to generate predictable domain names. So for NIMAIN, which is one of the families taken down in the arrest that was announced this morning, that had a domain generation algorithm as a part of it, where, okay, I've got a list of domains NIMAIN uses. If I'm the attacker, I only need to register a couple. And if somebody seizes my domain, I register another one. And if they seize all the domains for a given day, then I just register the domain for tomorrow. It's a way that they can persist over long periods of time. But the advantage it gives to people like me is if I can reverse engineer the algorithm, I can predict the domain names that they will use over long periods of time, and I can monitor what resolves and what doesn't. So I've got an example of a couple of DGA domains. You see new Fandel Tamati, right, and YBG whatever. You see they're garbage domains. You would never use that in a real application. But and the malware it's used by is Tinba or Tiny Banker. It's a small banking Trojan that was popular. Now, I know that if I block those domains, I am blocking access to the command and control for Tiny Banker, and I may have a banking Trojan. I may have a problem I still need to deal with, but I'm not losing banking information. I'm not losing credentials inside my environment because the malware cannot beacon out to where that stuff can be exfiltrated, and I can block that into domain generation algorithms. Another popular form of DGA is instead of using random characters like you saw on the previous slide, they can use word lists. So instead of just randomly picking between letters of A through Z or whatever subset they're using, they pick through a dictionary file. And you see that here, right? That history formertrial.com might be legit, probably not. But you see things that look like English words, or they are English words. It might be patent nonsense, it might not, and that was developed by criminals explicitly to defeat some machine learning algorithms that we were developing to detect random garbage domains. But these might actually resolve, and from time to time these wordless domains actually point to something that is otherwise benignly registered, because when you use random words and point them together, sometimes you collide with something that's actually registered. Ravnix is what they use for the word list is a declaration of independence. And one day the domain that Ravnix wanted to use was independence.com, which, as you can imagine, is actually registered. So you do want to be careful in terms of how you use some of these lists and what your own risk tolerance is to block things. But this obscure lore of domain generation algorithms is a big part of how malware works. And if you block these DNS requests to these domains or to the underlying IP addresses, you may have malware on a machine, but it can't communicate to the criminal. So you've got a hygiene problem. You want to clean it up. You'll be aware of it if you're paying attention to your logs, because you see something's querying to a domain that you blocked, but you don't have an active breach. So it gives you some advantages here. But the important thing to realize, and I may mention this a couple of times, is DNS is under the complete control of the adversary. If they register a domain name, they can point their domain and their host names to anything they want. So as an example, I like showing people when talking about this data and how you can protect your network with it. I can register a malicious DGA domain and point it to these 13 IP addresses. And for those who are tech savvy, they may recognize it. Those are the DNS root servers. There are 13 IP addresses that correspond to the 13 clusters of root servers out there that tells DNS resolvers where .com is, where .net is, .edu, .gov, .uk, are you, so on and so forth. If you block those 13 IP addresses in a firewall, you've broken DNS for your organization. And I mention this because most people, like I said, I go to www.google.com and it says, oh, okay, I'm going to go to Google and figure out where it is. Well, there's actually lots of steps in between, and the DNS root servers is one of those steps. If you interrupt that step, then DNS will not work for your organization, right? So it's very important to be very careful and deterministic about how you use this data to protect an organization, because you can do a lot of harm if you're not careful. If you use resolved IP addresses for response policy zones, right, those domains can point to anything that you want. As of now, there aren't any good name server or bad name server IP address feeds that I'm aware of, but that's part of my PhD research and actually creating it. So hopefully I will have something here in the coming months and year or so to justify a doctoral degree anyway. But to give more indicators and more pieces that we can look at, because every adversary, every attacker needs infrastructure. I only need to block a piece of that infrastructure to stop the entire chain of operation. I may not know what domain they're using, I may not know what IP address, but if I know their name server and I block that, then the query doesn't work anyway. So it gives me 4 opportunities, 4 bites at the apple right up front, before, just as malware is running, to find a way to block it. So it has some real power, but obviously, right, there's some ways you need to be careful and concerned about how you use this data so that you don't block obviously good infrastructure. And it has happened. I used that example in the previous couple of slides because I've seen these types of attacks take place from time to time by criminal actors. To generate those DNS files, right, if you're using bind, you see it's very simple text formatting. You just create a simple for loop to say, okay, here's 100,000 domains I feel comfortable blocking. You know, I just write those into a file with a for loop, or using Python. There's lots of different ways to do it. But if you're running your own DNS resolver, you can choose which feeds you are confident in, which indicators you want to block. Maybe you're not concerned about phishing, but you're concerned about crypto mining. You can go block that stuff instead. There's real importance to running your own DNS resolver and enforcing your own DNS resolving policy. If you're a larger organization, you know, you might have different policies in different areas. You might want to have different policies for your walled garden. Right? How you deal with a malware infection might be different than how you deal with a phishing URL. And certainly, again, to emphasize the previous few slides, you can create whitelists to prevent essential infrastructure from being blocked, right? Your first zone that you load at RPZ should be things like the DNS root servers and the name servers for top-level domains and your critical infrastructure, so that an attacker doesn't register a malicious domain and say point it to your own corporate web server or corporate email server as a way to attack your organization discreetly. So you have a lot of power in doing this, and it's very important to run and manage your own DNS resolvers. And this is infrastructure that almost everybody listening to this call is running one way or the other. And all they need to do is just populate logic into it, and it's very important to do so. And just as an aside, there's been a lot of press lately talking about DNS over HTTP, where Google will handle DNS through the browser, or Cloudflare will handle it through the browser. That takes away a lot of the security, or it takes away all the security that you can implement in DNS. And you'd be trusting organizations like Google and Cloudflare to provide you fast query response times, but they very consciously do not block maliciousness. And you will no longer be able to see what your employees are querying or not. So you lose a lot of visibility. So, I mean, if nothing else, if you don't want to manage and put things in your DNS resolvers, be aware that this is coming, and you'll have to make sure in your organization the DNS queries are going to you instead of a company that's going to data mine what you're looking at, if for nothing else, the visibility of what's going on your network. So that's very important. You can set some zone files, some response policy zones, to complete the query but log if you're concerned about the viability of using that as a block. The word list EGAs are a great example I talked about, right? There's 2 malware families at least that use word lists. Well, you might want to log those queries, because if you see a machine on your network going through, 50 or 100, 200 word list domains, you've got a problem, versus, oh, somebody just went to independence.com because it's the 4th of July in the United States. Okay, we can let that one go through. So you at least have the information for an analyst to make an informed judgment. But you can have all of these feeds be their own zone with their own policy with a whitelist up front. You could put it all into one zone file if you like, but then everything's more or less got to be a similar policy. You've got one big list of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of entries. It gets to be hard to diagnose. You won't know which policy or where it is, where something was generated. So if you basically the object-oriented equivalent of security design, you take all these feeds that are out there openly available, put them in their own zone files, so that when something's blocked, the DNS server will say, oh, it's this zone file, and you go into that zone file and make the necessary adjustment. All right. There's lots of interesting other non-standard things that you could do to use RPZ for interesting things. Going back to the DGA examples, I have a list of 1 million DGA domains that I resolved to see what IP addresses they point to, but I'm not particularly interested in sinkholes, right? That's just security researchers researching threats. So I block their name servers so that I don't populate my feeds with domains registered for Mark Monitor, or a sinkhole operator in Germany, or Shadow Server, or Sinkhole Tech, or a couple of other ones you see there. This allows for, like I said, an easy way to clean my own feeds and return those responses fairly quickly. Oops. Now, going to blocking name server IP addresses, I made reference to this a couple of times, right, going into my own research. A lot of people don't think of the authoritative name server, but it's an essential component of all of this works. In fact, one of the reasons, if you have a domain name, you're required to have 2 authoritative name servers, is because if your one server is down, then no one can reach your site. The protocol requires 2 name servers, hopefully on 2 different networks, for availability. But it is a difficult problem, right? How do you create a globally representative whitelist of IP addresses? That's a very hard problem. Doing it for name servers is even harder. But there are things that you can do to take a look. So for instance, for IP addresses, if you're blocking an IP address, why would you trust a name server from that same IP address? And I've got an example of 3 net blocks on here that at the point of time I generated these slides had a lot of maliciousness congregated there. I could simply just block all name server requests from that space, because that's heavily populated by scammers and spammers and phishing. What gets to be really beneficial, though, is when attackers have their own dedicated name server, authoritative name server. Many will use GoDaddy or the registrar's infrastructure, and certainly you can't block GoDaddy's name servers, authoritative name servers. You'd be blocking tens of millions, maybe even 100 million domains in one fell swoop. But if attackers run their own authoritative name server, because they have their own infrastructure, and it happens about half the time, give or take, maybe a little bit less than half the time, I can identify those and then block those. So when they register new domains and point those domains to new VPSs or new IP addresses, well, I'm still blocking the name server, and I can still block them. So it gets, like I said, another bite at the apple if you're very careful in how you do it. But getting it wrong means you could be blocking millions of things fairly quickly. So it is a viable and very useful technique that a lot of my research is going into figuring out ways to do that safely. But like I said, attackers have their patterns of operation. They have infrastructure they like reusing. They like going to the same VPN services or the same hosting providers, the same registrars, potentially running the same name server or name server configs. If I can find ways to enumerate which ones are malicious, I have a way to create persistent block lists. Or persistent blocking of threats, right? It's not hard to register a domain name. Many of us have done it. It's $10, $15. There are some providers that are free. But if you're using the same infrastructure, then I can block that and maintain protection, even though the attacker is changing some of their infrastructure. So, as an example, of blocking infrastructure that could be malicious. These are 2 domains from Matt's new. It's a little bit dated, but you see 2 domains in there, profitstring.com and girlfight-exit.com. Profitstring, I don't know, might be valid if you saw it. Girlfight-exit, you'd be kind of like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. But you see there's some reuse of IP addresses in there. You see Turkey in the United States, those IP addresses are in both lists. But what you also see is the name server names, right? jmanage.com and the fancastar.com, which are 2 different name servers, but they're present in both domains. They both use the same name server IP address. You could take a look at the name servers and realize that those are not common name servers. They're not regular. You could do some validation of what other domains may point to there. But you could take a look at that IP address. You could take a look at those name servers and then use that to have persistent blocking of that criminal's infrastructure and what they're doing. They, of course, can change their authoritative name server, but as I said, you've got 4 bites of the apple and DNS to block a threat. But this provides you 2 more beyond domains, because for DGAs, the domains may change daily. You see on this slide, there's only a 3-day difference between the domains, but on August 9th, there were 4 IP addresses. On August 12th, they were down to 2. They made some changes in there, but they maintained the name server configuration, which allows a persistent block if that's what you're blocking, right? They changed the registrar they were using. So there was some persistence that you could find there. To do this requires some publicly available information you might not be aware of that exists, because DNS is such an important resource. There's lots of data that's published about it that's freely available. One of those resources is CZDS, the Centralized Zone Data Service or Distribution Service, that allows for generic top-level domains to get the zone files. So a generic top-level domain is .com, .net, .edu, .gov, .trade. It's everything that's not a country code. .us is a CCTLD country code top-level domain. But for the generic top-level domains, you can get the zone files. And that gives you lists of name servers by domain. So you see the first 8 entries in the .com list, or .net list, excuse me, right, of 0-0-0-0.net. Its name server is ns1.fabulous.com and ns2.fabulous.com. The next domain has 4, ns1, 2, 3, and 4.cloudns.net, which lets you create a census of how frequent a name server is used to then create authoritative counts. To get an idea of the most popular name servers out there based off this data, domaincontrol.com, worldnic.com, nameservices.com are the most popular name servers out there used by domains, right? And most of those are used by registrars, right? You see googledomains.com. If you have your domain with Google and Google's doing your DNS, that's what it points to. You don't want to block any of these. Because there's no attacker that I'm aware of that has a name server responsible for hundreds of thousands of domains. They have tens or hundreds, maybe on the outside a few thousand domains. There isn't a criminal out there that's registering 500,000 domains, because I've got to pay for it too. Even if they were getting it for $1 a pop, what criminal is going to spend $500,000 on DNS? It's not going to be very many. But this lets you say, okay, here's my whitelist. I take the most popular name servers. I'm not going to block those either by name or IP address. The ones that are smaller, I could say, hey, this name server is responsible for 100 domains. 50 are already on my block list. You know what? I could block that, even though I don't know anything about the other 50. If something is half bad, then maybe I count it all bad. So as an example, anything over 1,000 domains, you might want to not block. Right? That's an arbitrary number. Maybe you want 3,000, maybe you want 500, whatever it is, you can pick. And this is something I'm actually studying of what threshold starts to get appropriate. But an interesting part of this research is that we think of the internet as this globally independent, disparate, decentralized thing. But when it comes down to it, it's highly centralized in certain points. That if you took the top 100,000 name servers, that represents 90% of the internet, right? There are 340, give or take, million domains on the internet. If I reduce it to a 100,000 top name servers, that's 90% of that. If you take GoDaddy's name servers alone, you could be talking about 10 million domains very, very quickly. The internet is radically more centralized today than we've given it credit for. You could also directly block name services for dynamic DNS providers. Dynamic DNS are basically free DNS providers like NoIP or DuckDuckDNS or a few others that allow people to register host names and point to IP addresses. People will use it benevolently if they want their access point with a VPN server at home. They'll register with dynamic DNS, so that always updates their IP address in a specific host name that they're aware of, so they can connect via host name, even though their underlying IP address may change. Criminals like using it because they don't have to run the infrastructure of authoritative DNS, and it's free and it's relatively anonymous to use. So a lot of dynamic DNS domains are used by criminals, but there's very few legitimate use cases for it, at least from the perspective of business, right? If somebody's using dynamic DNS to connect to their home router to do whatever they're connecting at home, look at their DVR maybe, well, that's not a business function. You could block that and you're not interrupting the flow of business. Or you could at least whitelist the specific dynamic DNS host names that are important to your organization. The link I gave you is a list of providers and dynamic DNS records that you could go take a look at. The list of providers itself is much shorter, but you could certainly block those name servers or block those name servers and then whitelist the specific domains you find safe and get a whole lot of protection from threats like remote access Trojans, which is fairly popular in dynamic DNS. All of these indicators are first created from an observation, right? There's a malware config, you're running things in a honeypot or spam traps or a sandbox, any number of things. There's lots of feeds out there. Some are open source, some can be directly put into RPZ, but they're generated daily after something bad has happened. It's post-observation, so it's not perfect. But what you can do is find patterns of reuse, find patterns of operation, and then block the persistent infrastructure, right, of any of the four places: domains, IP addresses, name server name, name server IP address. You get 4 bites of the apple, and you can start identifying bulletproof hosting networks, those operators and providers that cater to the criminal environment that are mostly malicious, and start blocking large amounts of the threats just by blocking small pieces of infrastructure. Criminals, like human beings, are creatures of habit. They go to similar infrastructure. Some top-level domains are more prone to abuse. You can go block at the top-level domain level, particularly some of the free top-level domains like .tk. But once you identify that provider, you block everything underneath. If they keep using it, they stay blocked. If you looked at over the 80 worst top-level domains out of 1,200, right? So at that point, you're really talking about, 7.5%. And if you block them, you're blocking 2/3 of the maliciousness on the internet, right? Of just a list of the 80 worst top-level domains, right? And you don't get into that by percentage, not raw counts. The most abused top-level domain by count is .com, but .com is 140 million domains. You'd expect a high number of maliciousness in there, but its abuse rate is lower than the internet average. So .com is relatively clean, but other top-level domains are not. Some of the Pacific Island countries, for an example, some of the new generic top-level domains, right? It does have a drawback. Not every miscreant uses bulletproof hosting or bad TLDs or uses name servers. But at a certain point, if you're a small business and I can show you a technique just based off providers, blocking malicious providers, that provides you 70% of protection relatively easy, we'd take that deal. There's a reason we still use antivirus. It doesn't block 100% of the threats, but it blocks 70, 80%, pick whatever percentage, and you don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. You can do the same thing here in DNS. Identify the malicious providers and start blocking an overwhelming majority of the threats with just a few small amounts of indicators that you put into your configuration. You can do the same for autonomous system numbers. The way IP addresses are assigned, Organizations are given net blocks. An organization may have multiple net blocks assigned to them, but they'll only have one autonomous system number, right, which is a network operator that may have one or more net blocks. Those ASNs could be malicious. They could be catered to bulletproof hosting. They could cater to spam, whatever threat there are. You can do the math here to also see, you know what, of the 1,000 IP addresses this provider has, I've identified 600 are malicious that are in abuse feeds. That's 60% bad. I'm going to go ahead and block their entire IP space. They're catering to criminals. There may be innocent people in there, but odds are they're probably not that innocent. It may be things that you haven't identified as bad yet, or no one else has identified as bad yet. But you block that, and you don't have to worry about that. Versus blocking Cloudflare's ASN, right? There's a lot of benevolence in Cloudflare, or blocking GoDaddy's ASN. There's lots of perfectly legitimate sites being hosted at GoDaddy. But you create lists and rankings of the abusiveness of a given network operator. One site to do that is bgpranking.circle.lu. It's actually back up now, where you can sit there and score the worst ASNs on the planet and just block the entire block itself in DNS. And you can block it in your firewall too, for that matter. And you don't have to worry about those places that cater to criminal organizations without worrying about, oh, I've just blocked, I don't know, Bank of America or whitehouse.gov or pick whatever domain you'd never want to block. Creating some analytics based off that, some research that I've gone through is identifying those networks by the number of IP addresses identified as abusive. You see in there 46 are listed as 100% abusive with a couple of their ASN names underneath, and it kind of drops off. These are the global, as of last month, I think is when I generated this data, the worst ASNs on the planet, right, that you could probably just block whole and entire. To do this, right, requires obviously mapping IP addresses to ASN. There are free services to do that. There's an online lookup, but there's also a TSV file you can download. You could set up a container, a Dockerized container for a service to look this stuff up locally, but allows you to say, hey, these 1,000 IP addresses in my abuse feed, 600 point to this ASN. That ASN has 800 IP addresses. It makes it 75% malicious. And now you just turn around and block that in RPZ, all based off simple addition and division type of work. So very, very useful. And then you could use RPZ to block the entire AS, right? This is an example of a net block, mind you, this is my employer, but one of our net blocks is 192.124.129.0. But then if I wanted to block that in RPZ, you see the two lines that are required in there to make sure any query to that was just NX domains. So I've identified that AS is bad. I put in 2 lines in my RPZ file. It's very manageable if I'm blocking the top 50 worst, because that probably gives me, 100, maybe 200 lines of config tops. That's very simple and manageable to start blocking overwhelming majorities of the threats. For top-level domains, you can do similar. The numbers of total domains for top-level domain is easy to figure out. You can do that with a service of who is XML API or domain tools to calculate how many domains in a given top-level domain are abusive and what that percentage is. And then nuke that stuff. Here's an example of things that you could nuke. The top 5 at one point in time are highly abused. At one point in time, .Air Force, the top level domain for .Air Force, was highly abused. There weren't that many domains there, but a lot were criminal, and a couple of them I could not fully attribute to where they were pointing to. One was a historical site for one of the numbered air forces, but a lot just pointed to interesting places elsewhere, and you can imagine the espionage possibilities that you could have there. As of about 3 weeks ago, these are the top worst top-level domains. You see .ki, which is Kiribati, Pacific Island nation of, I want to say it's under 200,000 people, but almost 40% of their domains were malicious. It's .rf, .vg, .sk, .so. You see a lot of country code top-level domains. .pw is usually a crowd pleaser also. So lots of things you could sit there and calculate. And now I could say, you know what, this top level domain is abusive. I'm just going to block everything under .ki, and then I never have to worry about it again. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope you found it valuable, right? There's lots of things you can do with DNS. It's the hidden underbelly of how a global internet works, and doing some simple analytics provides some ability to block overwhelming percentages of maliciousness. So at this time, we'll take a short break. If you have any questions that I can answer for you, go ahead and do that inside of your viewer window, and I will answer those questions now.
John, thanks a lot for this presentation. This was very informative, a lot of really interesting content in a short period of time. We do have some questions, but again, I would encourage attendees, if you've got additional questions at this stage, please do add them into the question window, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. The first question I have is, and I think you sort of alluded to it throughout the presentation, is that many modern browsers as well like to resolve not via the local DNS. So in very practical terms, I mean, how do you suggest people address that?
I said we're starting to get into the world where the browsers will be handling the DNS over HTTP. How I'm advising everybody to address it is to turn that off. I'm not sure what Chrome is going to do. At one point, they were talking that Chrome, that would be the default option, and Firefox would be the default option. But largely, if you want to protect your own infrastructure, you've got to run the things that allow it to be protected instead of outsourcing it to organizations who clearly say they aren't going to do anything with DNS. You know, if you want to go to badsite.com, they're not going to stop you. So running your own DNS resolver and making sure your browser has that turned off. I know a lot of people involved with writing DNS have real concerns about DNS over HTTP. You know, Paul Vixie has been particularly vocal about it. I have. But, you know, as these become the default options, we as technologists are saying, don't do this protocol, don't go there. But if they do, every organization we're talking to, we're saying, you know, you need to disallow this, because if you don't see DNS queries, then you're blind to large parts of your network and what's going on. And even if you're not using response policy zones, that level of blindness takes away a key tool from you know, your security operations center, security analysts to protect yourself in, you know, by using infrastructure by third-party companies who, frankly, their business model is to mine data off of every way they can to sell ads. So our you know, the kind of persistent advice in the security community is to simply disallow that, making sure if that does become the default option that you push out GPOs or whatever it takes to run your own DNS.
Okay, that was clear. Thanks a lot. One other question is a little bit more of sort of the developments in and around DNS. I mean, you've talked about DNS over HTTPS, but we're also hearing about, you know, DNSSEC, TLS 1.3 being introduced, and so on. Can you sort of share your view a little bit on the current initiatives, the developments, and the direction that these developments are taking?
Because DNS is so important, there's lots of add-ons we keep putting on top of it to try to make it secure. DNSSEC is one, where in essence you're creating a signature that can be verified so that your DNS responses can, in essence, be authenticated as coming from a trusted organization. We've seen a lot in the past few months of various forms of DNS espionage where people are hijacking domains and the like, so that, you know, pick whatever website, .gov or .mil or foreign government, instead of going to a government agency or a military agency that you think you're going to somebody who's spying on you. So there's definite concerns to be had there. DNSSEC is part of that, and certainly to deal with kind of man-in-the-middle types of attacks. TLS 1.2 and 1.3 are the same thing for SSL and TLS, the encryption certificates that allow secure web browsing with encryption. Again, similar but based off the HTTP protocol. With TLS 1.3, there's lots of protections in there to prevent man-in-the-middle snooping, but also make it difficult for businesses to do legitimate monitoring of their networks. So A lot of the developments we're seeing around encryption and around technology policy are weighing privacy much more heavily than security in ways that might not be possible for an organization to undo. DNS over HTTP, you can just set up your own DNS resolvers and enforce that policy locally. TLS 1.3, when everything requires that here in the coming months and maybe year, you've got to use TLS 1.3, and there's a much smaller window to legitimate monitoring of network traffic that you need to be aware of. But in all of these cases is, monitoring the developments, participating in the policy conversations that at least as security practitioners to say, yeah, privacy is important. The primary role of a security practitioner is to protect private data. We're the professionals that provide privacy, but they're tools that we need to be able to see that there's problems that privacy advocates are unaware of. So it's important to be involved in those debates, see how those will impact how protecting your organization will take place, because as time goes on, we're starting to lose tools that we've had to detect badness. And one example is GDPR, the privacy regulation in Europe, has led to us not having easy access to who owns and registered domain names with names and phone numbers and email addresses, and then correlating that. So that privacy development has led to a loss of security. So certainly being involved in those discussions as security practitioners is very important, and seeing how that affects your own organization's ability to protect itself.
Okay, thank you. There's a practical question here for people that do not have the expertise to set up bind with RPZs. What or does in your view does Quad 9 provide adequate protection?
Quad 9 provides some measure of protection, right? It's designed for a broad consumer environment, so their philosophy and what they block or not is different. In any time when you use a third-party provider, whether it's Quad 9 or OpenDNS, in essence, they're setting the policy, and they may have different assumptions or risk appetites than you do. It's better than nothing in all cases, right? They're blocking malicious requests to malicious infrastructure. The ideal way of doing it, if you've got the time and resources, is to run something on site. Bind itself is fairly simple to install and configure. Active Directory uses DNS by default as a DNS server and by default, but certainly there are a lot of providers out there that will provide you RPZ feeds directly to your DNS server to handle the updating for you, to handle the curation and whitelisting. So all you're really doing is basically plugging into a third-party service also. Whatever you choose, pick something, right? Quad 9 is free. Many organizations don't have a security budget, so at a certain point, Quad 9 is a not-for-profit designed to provide broad protection for free to society. If you have no other choice and are willing to leave reporting and customization on the table, by all means use Quad 9s. Quad 9s is what I use at home, in addition to some stuff that I do locally. So certainly that's the other piece of this is every organization has employees. They take laptops home with them. Those laptops can be infected and compromised anywhere they happen to be, not just inside their corporate environment. So you certainly could set those laptops to Quad 9s or get a commercial DNS solution on those devices to enforce a custom policy and provide reporting.
Okay. And then there's two other questions that are, I think you've sort of alluded to throughout the presentation, but I'll ask them all the same. One of them is related to IP lists and how you could use them in conjunction with RPZs, and then the second one is related to the sort of the automatic or the generated domain names that you refer to, and how you can sort of stay ahead of attackers in that space. I think you alluded to both of them, but if you don't mind, just sort of.
Sure. For IP addresses, and it's relatively straightforward is how you put those in the configuration file. We start getting proactive is identifying malicious networks. That way, if they just spin up a new VPS at whatever bulletproof hosting provider, they get a new IP address, but it's going to be in the same net block of that malicious provider. at which point you can identify, hey, these are the malicious providers. I'm just going to block them whole and entire. So then they've got to go someplace else. And the reason is different providers have different appetites of what abuse they tolerate. There are people who are always emailing hosting companies or network providers saying, hey, this domain is malicious, this IP address is malicious. We know the ones who respond to requests. We know the ones who are just going to ignore us. So we identify those malicious ones and simply just block them. At which point then they've got to deal with providers that are going to take their stuff down. So for instance, every now and then, we see a domain that's hosted on AWS or an IP address in AWS engaged in malicious activity, but they only last for a couple hours because, somebody sends a note to Amazon, Amazon nukes the whole service, bans the account, and that's just that. Going to that provider level helps create a smaller and smaller world in which these criminals can operate. For domains, it's a little easier because there's so many different artifacts of a domain name. For an IP address, right, it's just like, one day I go to Linode, the next day I go to AWS, the next way I go to OVH or wherever. But a domain, there's often patterns. For domain generation algorithms, right, it's a predictable pattern, right? If I've got the algorithm, I've reverse engineered it from malware, and knows how it generates domains, then I can create it. Okay, tomorrow's domains are going to be this. Next year's domains are going to be this, which gives me a long-term predictive model unless they change their DGA. The same thing with name servers. They have a pattern that they keep using. They can change it. In some cases, it's easier than others, but I've got something persistent that they stick on. I figure out a pattern of their operation, and I block that, and that provides me some long-term, not permanent, but long-term and sticky protection of a network and my customers.
All right. Well, John, once again, I'd like to thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I'd like to thank all of the attendees for their time and for attending. Please do follow us on social media. We have webinars usually on a monthly basis, so you can get all of the updates and invitations to the new webinars. And as said, this webinar is recorded, so we will post the recording online within the next couple of days. With that having been said, thanks again, everybody, and have a good day.